Hello, my name is Gwendolyn Hall-Smith. I'm calling from Cabot, Vermont, and I'm here to give a class for Ani Sulisjawati and her KLAS online group. Bear with me for a minute while I get the slideshow going. All right, so this is a class on economic systems change. And to understand how to change economic systems, you also need to think about how our economic system works, how do systems change, where the leverage points are for change, and how do we take action to do something about it. Now, first of all, how does our economic system work? We have to ask what a system is before we get to the answer to that. I understand that most people in the class have been taking quite a bit of new lessons on systems dynamics, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you do need to understand that a system is a group of interacting or interrelated parts that form a unified whole. The things go into the system and they come out of the system. Boundaries are an issue, how the surroundings are issues, but you need to understand the whole system before you can change it. Now, the economic system is driven by human needs. It's formed and shaped by laws, regulations, rules, and customs. It facilitates and benefits businesses and organizations. A lot of the rules in our economic system are set up to benefit businesses and organizations. It requires, in modern times, public infrastructure, roads, transportation, water treatment, waste management, communication, and housing. And the goals of the system, which are a very important part of changing any system currently, are for maximizing profit and productivity. Now, all of this interacts very closely with our fundamental life support systems on Earth. And the economy draws from those life support systems for a lot of its value. And so we need to think about how the Earth is treated in the economic system, because right now we're in a major crisis and we need to change something, and we need to change it fast. Now, economies are complex systems. They're not simple systems. And complex systems are characterized by having emergent properties where feedback drives dynamic change. And in economies, basically, we have all of these human needs: social needs, governance needs, economic and material needs, and we take action to meet those needs. The action we take, obviously, has an impact on and is regulated by the capacity of the various systems to meet our needs, which in turn is informed and reprovisioned by the natural resource regeneration rate of whatever that system is. So if we're harvesting wood faster than the forest grows again to meet our needs for housing and furniture and all the things we make with wood here in Headwaters, we heat with it, then we're not doing it in a sustainable way, because we're eroding the capacity and undermining our ability to take action in the future. So feedback drives change, and this is an example of feedback. There's dynamic change over time. Things don't stay the same. There is no equilibrium. And emergent properties are characteristic of complex systems where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Now, the legal structures, which are those things we can change, these form the container of the economic system, and they mediate all of the things that we do to meet our needs. So in this picture, all the needs we have are in the middle, and they're informed and regulated and controlled by the box. This is the box we live in, and some of these subsystems are so part of our culture now that they're almost invisible. So the 5 main areas of the rules of the economic operation that I've discerned are ownership, money, markets, management, and metrics. Now, the handy way to remember this and to remember the path to the new economy is this mnemonic about Om. And I chose that because I think it's really important to align our economic life with our spiritual life and our deepest held values and beliefs. Ownership. We take this for granted. We don't question it much in our current system. But if you think about it, ownership may be at the heart of the domination paradigm that people are talking about that basically governs our current system. And this can be seen in one of the pernicious forms of ownership, which is slavery, where actually human beings are owned. Here in the United States, we have a horrible, horrible history of slavery and genocide, and I want to acknowledge that and apologize for it. But there are other types of slavery that we don't talk about very much. Women have been owned by their husbands for thousands of years and still are in some parts of the world. They don't have the right to own their own property. They are treated like slaves. Children are still owned by their parents and can still be sold in many parts of the world. Enslaved people are denied fundamental human rights, which is a crime against humanity. And yet, with the ownership patterns we have around earth and land, we're treating earth as a slave rather than as our sacred mother. And I think we need to look deeply into some of these ownership paradigms to both understand and transcend that way of being. Now, you can tell, even looking historically, that land and earth have played a really important part in our economic development. This chart shows back in the 1700s, the land and agricultural land accounted for more than half the value of the national capital as a percentage of national income. And yet, over the last 400 years or so, this has come down to almost zero. So, and yet, also you see after the early 70s, when the monetary system changed, we see an acceleration of housing and the housing value being a percentage of national income. And this is another reflection of how land values work. But other assets that we own in our system are things like businesses and stocks and bonds, money, productive capacity, and goods, especially luxury goods. So all of these things play a role in how the economy works, and a lot of rules are set up around how these things are traded or sold or bought, or when you can own them and when you can't, etc. In the corporate era, of course, we've seen corporate ownership take over quite a lot of our lives, and around the economic system, they're dominant now. We've moved from an era in the last century of robber barons, where individuals owned vast quantities of capital and regulated the way millions of people's lives work. But now the shareholders own those same companies for the most part. And we've seen the era of leveraged buyouts, stock buybacks, and all of the side effects of this type of ownership that aren't always necessarily good for the economy. I would recommend anybody interested in this read Marjorie Kelly's book, The Divine Right of Capital, because she goes over that very well. She talks a lot about shareholder primacy, which is the bottom line in most of our corporate ventures right now. The most important thing, according to Milton Friedman, which gave birth to the neoliberal era, is a company earning profits for its shareholders. Shareholder primacy is held higher than the natural world and the communities in which the companies are based. Bondholder primacy, much the same thing. The bond holders are the ones that need to be served before any of the other conditions in the economic system. Public goods and privatization are also one of the side effects of the corporate era, where increasingly we see the financialization and privatization of things that formerly were either the commons or public goods. And of course, externalities, big problem. You know, this type of corporate ownership doesn't actually own the impacts of any of their activities, but they refer to them as externalities and try to escape responsibility for them. Now, this question of ownership obviously was one of the big questions in the initial conflicts that were held during the colonization era. You know, especially here in the United States, one of the reasons that we had so many issues with the Native Americans we met when we came over here was because we both had completely different cultural ideas about owning land. To the Native Americans, it was a horrible idea to own Mother Earth. And now, 400, 500 years later, I think many of us are seeing that they were really right in that estimation. Now we see new forms of ownership coming up and growing in the Western world. They still are a fairly small part of the economic system, but cooperatives and employee-owned businesses and ESOPs, community land trusts, nonprofit organizations, and benefit corporations, which is a new form of corporation, that's been adopted by several states in the United States called benefit corporations. These are coming up, and they are more democratic than the traditional forms, which is also good. Money is another really important rule of the game and structure, economic structure, that needs to change if we want a just and sustainable world. But in order to understand why and how, we need to understand money a little bit better. So what is money? Money, when you take an economics class, they tell you it's a means of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. But these aren't what money is actually. This is what money does. What money is, in fact, is an agreement. It's an agreement that will use some particular instrument to pay our taxes and debts, to buy things in exchange with each other. And like most agreements, it lives in that legal world instead of the world of natural phenomena. You know, when they invented marriage, which is another legal agreement, it wasn't long before they invented divorce. So we need to think about divorcing our current form of money because it's not serving us anymore. A lot of the monetary system impacts of the form of money we use, I've outlined in this book, Creating Wealth, which you can get for free on my website, www.hallsmith.org/writing, and other websites I have too. But basically, there are 5 system conditions that drive these problematic impacts. It's privately owned, debt-based, positive interest, monoculture, and monopoly. These 5 system conditions lead inexorably to human impoverishment and the growth imperative. And so we need to look at how to change these system conditions in order to change the monetary system. So when we say it's privately owned, who owns the money? Well, 90% of the money in circulation comes into being through the issuance of debt by the banking and the finance sector. Banks make money by supplying us with money. They create it out of thin air. And indebted people are the ones paying the interest to the banks and their owners for the privilege of using this money. The burden of interest payments keeps people enslaved now as effectively as the feudal bonds did back 400 or 500 years ago. And it acts as a massive transfer of wealth from people without a lot of money to the people with a lot of money. So if you're looking for the source of the 1% and the 99% that we hear so much about in our economic dialogue these days, you don't need to look farther than the monetary system. Here's an example of one of the memes that popped up after the last crash. You know, she says she paid $125,869 for a house that's currently worth $91,000, and the bank is taking it back because the bank says she still owes them $355,692.91. That's the kind of illogical homelessness that we're increasingly getting here in the United States because of this indebted form of money that we use for all our transactions. As I said, this indebted form of money drives the growth imperative, environmental destruction, human impoverishment, species extinction, and global war. So it's an important system to change. The monoculture aspect of money speaks to the fact that even though we have pesos and yen and dollar and euros and rubles and tenge and all these other types of currencies, it's essentially the same kind of money all over the world. And it's based in the banking system. And what it means is when the banking system crashes, the whole system comes down around our ears, which just isn't such a good idea. It's a lot like an agricultural monoculture. You know, if there's one pest in that field, the entire field is going to fail. One of the answers to this, of course, is to create an ecosystem of currencies. Ecosystem of currencies could serve a number of different purposes. So I tend to refer to them as special purpose currencies: a time bank, a care bank, food currency, commercial barter systems, loyalty currencies. All of these are outlined in the book that I wrote. You're welcome to read it. And they all play a role in different economic niches. They also are not issued with debt. So it's not such a big problem to go negative in a time bank or a care bank or a food currency, as long as you're ready to meet your obligations in the future. You're not necessarily going to keep accruing interest and getting deeper and deeper into debt just because you've gone negative. Public banks and cryptocurrencies are another innovation and invention that can help get out of the problems that we're in with our current monetary system. I'm talking too about public cryptocurrencies, not private cryptocurrencies, which don't really exist yet because they're all private right now. But in the future, I can imagine that we'd have cryptocurrencies and banks that are owned by the public, where the profits from those systems benefit the public. They can serve as a clearinghouse for special purpose currencies. They can be a separate entity regulated like a public utility. They can be owned by different public institutions. These are types of public banks that exist already. And around the world, there's a number of different state infrastructure and development banks that also serve in this capacity. So there are already lots of public banks around the world, but they tend to be in the minority. They're 40% of the world's financial systems. The Sparkasse banks in Germany are perhaps the oldest ones. They're about 200 years old. And we have here in the United States, the Bank of North Dakota, which is 100 years old. And both have been very successful at creating prosperity in the areas that they serve. Markets is another important leverage point and set of rules and regulations that govern the economic system. Right now, a lot of the markets that we imagine are free markets are actually manipulated markets. And here's a headline from last week that underlines that. Real estate, stocks, bonds, international currency, gold and silver, private cryptocurrencies. All of these have had various types of interventions, either from the billionaires or from states that are trying to change the way gold is behaving, or from the big financial firms that run this nano trading through their black boxes. But they're all manipulated. They're not a free market anymore. I don't think they're particularly trustworthy for the average person. But there are some market trends that are looking toward a better future. The LOHAS market, which has been created largely by the interest in lifestyles of health and sustainability, that's what LOHAS stands for, is now a multi-trillion-dollar market in the United States. The green economy, renewable energy, care programs, social services, all of these things that help build social and economic justice and environmental integrity, those have a growing interest and are growing market share. The creative economy has now surpassed the industrial economy in the United States in terms of its employment and overall economic performance. Fair trade and the fair trade movement has created markets for those products around the world. Organic certification, again, has created a market for organic products, and forest management certification the same way. So our policies and rules actually drive a lot of the market decisions that are made. And we need to look at all those policies and rules to see how to make them more sustainable and just. Management is another big category for the rules that are made. And by management, I mean to include all of those things that companies do and organizations do. The accounting rules that they have to follow, all of the different policies that they have to have on hand. We have seen, thanks to some of the people in the Balaton group and others, a new era in corporate responsibility that includes things like whole systems accounting and cradle to cradle production, employee benefits, community contributions, and most importantly, the corporate culture taking responsibility for the economic and social impacts of their activities. Metrics, finally, are the last question that I'm going to look at. Metrics right now are measured in terms of gross domestic product or gross national product. GDP and GNP are the measurements that we use for economic systems. There are alternatives to these measurements, including the genuine progress indicator, which factors in social, economic, and environmental factors, and the gross national happiness movement in the United States, which really tries to look at how happy people are in the economy. There's a lot of work being done on these, and I'd encourage you to look them up if you're interested. Now, this is sort of the basics of how the economic system works, and in order to think about how to change it, we need to think some about how systems change. It's not that easy. Some systems are very resistant to change, and if you push them in one direction, they'll push harder back. Some of the change points in systems are counterintuitive. That's one of the big lessons that the people that have been doing systems modeling over the last quarter century have found. And so one of the insights that I find really valuable from our friends at Balaton and the computer modeling world is the idea of leverage points, that there are leverage points in systems that can change those systems. Donella Meadows talked about how leverage points have increasing leverage. If you're just looking at the problems on the surface, you're at the tip of the iceberg. Underneath the problems, there are patterns of behavior and systemic structures, and most important of all, mindsets that drive a lot of those system dynamics. You have increasing leverage as you go down into that mindset space. Now, she outlined a number of different system intervention points that have increasing leverage as you go around this U curve, starting with the constants, parameters, and numbers like subsidies, taxes, and standards, which, if you think about it, when we're doing policy interventions, those are often the first things that we think of, even though they are at the lowest end of the leverage cycle. The size of buffers and stocks relative to their flows, the structure of material stocks and flows, and how the structure works, where they intersect, how they flow, the length of delays between cause and effect, self-correcting mechanisms, self-reinforcing mechanisms, the flow, accessibility, and timing of information, rules and regulations, the power over rules and regulations, which I've summarized here as participatory democratic process, setting conscious goals, and shifting paradigms and mindsets. So as you go up this list, you get into higher and higher leverage positions. Now, how do we look at these leverage factors in relation to the new economy? Let's start with ownership. The ownership of land has been evolving over thousands of years, and the cultivation and private ownership of land that got away from the previous tribal forms has led a lot of people to believe that recognizing our universal rights for land and the living and paying birthright dividends to the people of the earth from all the productive processes that have exploited and used those our shared inheritance, this could be in the form of a universal basic income, would really be a step in the right direction. We need to restructure enterprises toward local worker owners, cooperatives, and community land trusts, creating public banks and issuing public money. The leverage points that these strategies show are paradigm and mindset change, the goals of the system, the distribution of power over the rules of the system, and the rules of the system. This is very high leverage, according to Dana's ranked hierarchy. Money again, what are the strategies here? Creating public banks and public money, special purpose currencies, to manage universal basic income, care for people and nature, carbon, food, water, and small and medium-sized business transactions. There are already special purpose currencies all over the world that work in these areas. Similar to the last one, these are very high leverage points because of the kind of paradigm and mindset shift they require and the change in the rules of the game. Markets, if we set policy to fully account for all the costs involved in any production process and eliminate externalities, we change the markets. If suddenly the impact of global warming and climate change had to be factored into anything with that used fossil fuels, we'd be in a different world. If we required consumer transparency for products that use finite resources or have harmful emissions, we'd be in a different world. People would buy better products. This is also a very high leverage point because it changes the rules and information flows and material flows. So it's high leverage point. Management changes, cradle to cradle production, whole system accounting, employee stock ownership programs, corporate responsibility for community and impacts, also supporting and fostering more local investment. All of these are high leverage activities as well. And metrics, the gross national happiness and the genuine progress indicators, measuring what matters, improving transparency, providing feedback, doing public accounting, all of these factor into information flows and driving positive feedback loops, which have medium leverage. Still very important. So how do you take action on all of this? Well, I've written a little workbook with my colleague Bernard about how to take action in your local community to improve your local economy. You can download it at no charge on my website, which is right here. There's other resources on these websites for how to take action. I've written a few workbooks on how to develop a long-range sustainability plan for your city or how to develop a long-term sustainable economic development plan for your city. Those are all on these websites as well. So that's the end of my formal presentation. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and questions that you have. I did it this way to try and make sure I fit in the time frame. So I'm really hoping to have a good conversation. Take care now.